Well, folks, the 2026 Texas Senate race could be a vicious election, starting with the primaries, where you have incumbent Senator John Cornyn, who is running to serve his fifth term representing Texas in the upper chamber. But we have current Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is vowing and has announced that he's going to challenge Cornyn in what will be the nastiest Republican primary, probably even primary across the country, that we will see in the 2026 election cycle. This is a true face-off between the old guard of the Republican Party and the new hard-right populist portion of the conservative movement, the people who more align themselves with President Trump. So, before we jump into this race, drop down below, hit that subscribe button, make sure you don't miss another video from us again in the future. So we're going to jump into all of this right now. Before we can talk about the election, we really have to talk about the feud that has occurred over the last couple years that has been brewing in the Texas GOP. You know, Paxton and Cornyn have been clashing in the state for years. There's no doubt about it. Paxton has criticized Cornyn as being an insufficient conservative, especially when it comes to issues like extra funding for Ukraine, which I think we can all agree on. There was a big issue with the establishment Republicans when it came to aid to Ukraine. And you could say that, hey, I support aid to Ukraine as long as there's an off-ramp. I support deterring Russia by funding Ukraine if there's an off-ramp. What we don't, and not everybody has to support that, but even then, if someone's like, hey, yeah, I support, let's send a couple $1 billion to Ukraine, let's help them deter Russia from continuing to invade, but we need to drive Russia, we need to put sanctions and tariffs on Russia, we need to drive them to the negotiating table. But that's not what the Republicans or the establishment Republicans and the Democrats did. They sent billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars to Ukraine with no off-ramp. There was no off-ramp that they were, you know, maybe they said that they wanted this off-ramp, but what were they actually doing to make sure this off-ramp occurred? And, you know, and then vice versa, you look at it where you have John Cornyn, who's gone after Ken Paxton, especially when it comes to his legal troubles and his 2023 impeachment. It's like, and there's no doubt, Ken Paxton has had legal issues, whether it's the security fraud issues where he was basically promoting a business or a stock investment and failed to notify his investors that he was basically trying to pitch this to, that he failed to notify them, saying that he was actually being paid by that business to promote the stock. Now, obviously, this has been litigated in court over the last 10 years, but that is definitely political baggage. You know, there was a federal investigation over some potential bribery or improper influence, some things that had to do with Paxton potentially sending federal funds or projects from the federal or from the state government to a campaign, a supporter. So, you know, there's obviously some baggage there. We're not really going to comment much further on that because everything is still pending. There is no, you know, official verdict in any of this, but you can clearly see that there is a big infight between the establishment Republicans in Texas and the more populist Republicans that you have in Texas. And it's fair to say there is a clear winner in this race here. The populist Republicans have much more support of the base of Republican voters than the establishment Republicans. Now, it's safe to say that the establishment Republicans could get more independent votes, maybe some disenfranchised Democrats, people who, you know, don't really fit in line with the Democrat Party, but also don't feel like they fit in line with the new Republican Party. Yes, is Cornyn going to get some support that way? But ultimately, Texas doesn't rely as much on Democrats and independents to elect their representatives as other states, maybe like Wisconsin or Michigan do, where Republicans have a serious advantage in the state of Texas. But we know this is going to be very, very sticky for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, that it is going to be very big. Typically, the National Senatorial Republican Committee, which they fundraise and campaign for Senate candidates, typically they are going to back the incumbents that are proven winners. They've won in races before. That is just what they do. And if anything, I would expect that they don't endorse anybody in the primary, because this could be tough. When you're looking at, you look at the state of Texas. Last time Cornyn won in Texas was in 2020, when he won by roughly about 10 points. Now, it is fair to say that they may not endorse here, because they know Cornyn, he is the incumbent. He is an established Republican who probably has the backing of a lot of different, and they don't even have the Maybe he hasn't got any endorsements yet at this point, but my guess is a lot of the establishment Republicans are going to come out and endorse John Cornyn. No doubt about it. But when it comes to the actual senatorial committee, they may hold off because the reality is like we said, in Texas, it is very clear that the Ken Paxton portion of the Republican Party dominates in Texas. To not alienate voters away from the Republican Party in the general election, this may be a step that they decide to take. But then you also have to factor in President Trump. I do expect that President Trump will endorse in the primary, and I think he'll endorse Ken Paxton. Trump has gone after Cornyn on multiple different issues in the past. Now, I just think it's tough. You kind of have to. It's a double-edged sword that you're dealing with here. But Donald Trump probably will endorse Ken Paxton. At least that's what I'm expecting. And considering that this is a state that President Trump won by, I think, like 14 points. He won the state by 14 points. This is going to be a safe seat. So this is the type of state where you want to see a primary where if you have a Republican you don't like, you're comfortable primarying them because you know ultimately that you're most likely going to still win the general election at the end of the day. That's not the same for places like, Pennsylvania or Georgia or, North Carolina even. Maybe North Carolina, actually, you could make that case. And we're actually doing a video later today on that exact case, the North Carolina, the Republican primary, what could potentially going on there. But this is a state where Trump won by 14 points. We know Ted Cruz in his most recent election won by, look at that. It's like he still trailed behind Trump by a decent amount. Trailed behind him by 7 points, 6.5 points. So even when it comes to these down ballot races, they're not getting as much support as Trump got. But you could see this be a 4, 5, 6 percentage point race. So I think the Republicans do need to be careful. They need to be careful with Paxton because I do believe Cornyn, if he is the nominee, will win by a larger margin than Paxton. I still think Paxton will win, but ultimately it just is going to depend on where's the mood of the country, which direction's the wind blowing when the political winds are blowing. How is President Trump been able to deliver on his domestic agenda, his spending agenda when it comes to the trade, tariffs? What is he able to get out of this? Is Trump able to take the off-ramp when it comes to tariffs? They're ramping up tariffs on China to over 100% at this point, which, granted, I 100% support it when it comes to China. I think we can nitpick the other tariffs that he's rolled out, and I definitely have my criticism of it, but when it comes to China, I'm all about that. You can't go to... It's like China steals our IP. They have no environmental regulations. They don't have any labor laws. They're able to get really the actual cost of what they do down so low because they exploit the workers, the labor that they have there. But getting back to the race, it is safe to say it's a safe seat to primary an incumbent Republican who Trump is maybe not very favorable with. But my only advice to the national Republicans is they better vet Ken Paxton hard. Not necessarily in an effort to help Cornyn win in the primary, but to uncover what liabilities are associated with Paxton, especially when you get to a general election. And really when it comes to his legal troubles, when it comes to the securities fraud, when it comes to the federal investigations, when it comes to the impeachment proceedings from 2023. Or, there's a whistleblower lawsuit from 2020, I believe. Now, I'm not commenting whether they were right, wrong, or indifferent, but these are things Democrats could leech onto. They can definitely leech onto these and try and exploit it. And in the state of Texas, in a competitive election, remember, look back to 2018 with Ted Cruz. What did we see there? Trump won the state in the presidency in Texas. He won the state by 9 points. Fast forward to 2018, and Ted Cruz was in a pretty tight re-election race between him and Beto O'Rourke when Cruz ended up only winning by about 2.5 points. So this can be a close election. Even when Trump wins by large margins, this could be a close election, especially if the political winds are going against Donald Trump in the current incumbent Republican administration. But the National Republicans better vet Ken Paxton very well, and they better be able to handle the criticism, the political blowback. There's a lot that comes along with it. So I'm not going to say if I think he's guilty or not, or what he did was wrong, morally, ethically, whatever. But there is already political baggage that comes with him. And who knows what else could be uncovered in a general election in a state Democrats will be spending a lot of money in. We know Texas Democrats have this blue Texas dream. And I've made videos on it before, we've talked about this a lot. The blue Texas dream is dead. It really is. I truly believe that blue Texas dream that they had in 2018 and 2020 is dead. There might be some close elections, sure. I don't think you're going to have the structural, what we saw in 2018. I don't think you're going to see that again. But you know what happened. Look at what happened with Tim Walz. Tim Walz ran in Minnesota. He was kind of this weird, bumbly moron, but kind of had some halfway decent ideas. And I'm not saying that's my own opinion, but that's kind of the people of Minnesota. That's kind of what they found. But then when he gets put in the national spotlight and they really put the magnifying glass on him, all of a sudden all of this stuff starts to come out that was never uncovered in a statewide election. So we know the Democrats are going to spend a lot of money in Texas, and we already know Colin Allred is most likely going to be the nominee again in 2026. So just be ready. Be ready. Be ready for anything that the Democrats are going to throw at you. And we know voters give Donald Trump, some people like to counter that idea of, the political baggage that will come along with Ken Paxton. And they want to talk about Donald Trump and how he has all this political baggage. And let's just acknowledge a reality. Voters give Donald Trump much more leeway when it comes to his political baggage than voters give elected officials down ballot. It's true across the board. You've seen it everywhere. You've seen Donald Trump win in places like Arizona, where he had a lot of political baggage. He had a lot of political baggage in 24. A lot. The Democrats tried to brand him as this felon. They tried to brand him as what was it at the time? He's a threat to democracy, and now it's a constitutional crisis. And voters in Arizona gave Donald Trump in 2024, they gave him a lot of leeway and voted for him by 5 points after voting for Biden barely in the 2020 election. But in this same race, you look at the Senate map. Carrie Lake lost by 2.5 points. She ran 7 points behind Donald Trump. So it is very clear that Republicans can look at Donald Trump, say, hey, we see this baggage. We're okay accepting this baggage that comes along with you. But they'll look at even the next notch down at the Senate or the governor's race or representative's race and say, you know what, the political baggage that comes along with you, sorry, we just can't handle it when it's closer to us. The more local the election, the less political baggage that people want. The higher up the chain, the more political baggage they are ultimately okay with. And Donald Trump is just a creature in his own. It's his own unique, nuanced animal and not animal in a bad way, just as in trying to define what he is. He's kind of all over the place some days, but voters give him a lot of leeway. And we just need to be very cautious that if this is the route that the Texas GOP wants to go in nominating Ken Paxton, you just need to make sure you do your homework. Make sure you know what's going to be thrown at you. Like we said, look at what happened in Texas 2018. It was a close race. Democrats put a lot of money in there. And Colin Allred, I'm not going to say he's the best candidate, but ultimately he came, in 2024. Allred was able to run, he got 44% of the vote. At the same time when Harris got 42% of the vote. So he got 2 percentage points more than Harris. He was able to run ahead of the Democrat on running for the presidency. So you just have to be careful here. But we ultimately know that Paxton is very popular with the Texas GOP. And in recent polling, I believe it was from the Mitchell. Let's see. Let's find it right here. Let's see. From Lake Research. Okay. Oops, where did that go? Here we go. This is from Lake Research. And a recent polling from Lake Research Partners shows that Cornyn, 22 points underwater. Let's see where, right here. John Cornyn, 22 points underwater. You see Ken Paxton's about 5 points underwater, 35% favorable, 40% unfavorable. John Cornyn, 21% favorable, 43% unfavorable. Let's look at the breakdown on these numbers here. Ken Paxton, it's like, look at this. Oh, and they don't have it broken down by actual political party, and that's okay. But look at this. John Cornyn, only 5% of the electorate find him very favorable. 16 somewhat favorable. 27% very unfavorable. No opinion, never heard of. So you're still looking at, 40% of the electorate that has either never heard of him or just doesn't have an opinion on him in Texas, which that's big, but also for an incumbent senator he's been an incumbent senator from Texas for years. It's like, what was he elected initially back in 2002, I think? Let's see if we can get that. Yeah, Cornyn initially, I believe 2002, he was initially elected. Yeah, because he was not, let's see. Yeah, initially elected back in 2002. You have been in state politics, and I believe he was on the Supreme Court before that. He may have even been a representative or held another statewide office. You've been in elected politics for, in the state, just in the Senate for 25 years. You've probably been in politics for close to 40 years in the state, 4 decades. And you're telling me that there's 20% of the voters just have no idea who you are or have no opinion of you? That's kind of big. So maybe that is some room to work with for Cornyn. But ultimately, look at this. With Ken Paxton, you're looking at, a quarter, 24% of the electorate saying that they have no opinion or have never heard of him, which potentially name recognition could be a big thing to drive out, especially to energize the Republican base. I don't think John Cornyn is going to energize the Republican base. He relies more on moderate Democrats break in, independents break in for him, Republicans break in for him. Ken Paxton is going to rely a lot more on the MAGA base. He's going to drive out, and not saying you're going to be able to drive out low propensity voters the way Donald Trump was able to drive them out, but I definitely think Ken Paxton will drive up low propensity voters at a much higher rate in the Republican Party than you are going to see John Cornyn do that. I think that is just a simple fact the Republican Party grasps with is the establishment Republicans don't get their victories from the base. They get it from this moderate, this kind of overarching appeal that they have. And like we said, overall, Paxton is 14% more favorable than Cornyn. 14 points. And another poll shows that Cornyn is trailing a generic Republican. Look at this. Here's some polling that we have right here. Let's see. John Cornyn, and let's look at the hypothetical polling, actually. Look at this. From Victory Insights, early January, 600 likely voters. John Cornyn is in the Republican primary, is trailing basically anyone else by 5 points, outside of the margin of error. At a bare minimum, even if you took it to the extreme and said it's, 4 points, against John Cornyn as far as the margin of error, and so he would really be at maybe 39%. You're still 1 point outside of the margin of error here. And a quarter of voters here are undecided in this race. And I really think if you're looking at the MAGA, the Republican base, I just don't see them breaking for John Cornyn. And it's like, even if it broke for him 50-50 from those undecideds, he still doesn't win. He still loses. He would need that to break for him, like from that 25%, like 60-40, 70-30. It's like he would need to have a pretty big break. And ultimately, I think he would need an endorsement from President Trump if he really wanted to win this election, especially in the primary. And when you replace that, the someone else, I guess you could say, or the, generic Republican, when you replace the generic Republican with Ken Paxton, the margin for Paxton expands to almost 8 points from Victory Insights. Look at this. So Cornyn loses a point of support. Ken Paxton or the someone else gains 2 percentage points. That is just insane. It's kind of the same thing you're looking at in North Carolina, where you have Tom Tillis, who's running. They did a hypothetical polling with Laura Trump in that race. Doesn't even live in the state anymore. Isn't even running. But somehow she was polling like 60% in a primary poll. And Tom Tillis was getting like 11%. It's like, this is embarrassing for an incumbent Republican. It really is. And, Cornyn had an opportunity. He could have pivoted. He could have pivoted to which way the party was going. But this just shows that support for Paxton towers over the support that Cornyn has in the Republican Party. Because ultimately, the primary is not about appealing to the entire state. It's about appealing to the Republican Party, to the base. And we know this is going to be a fierce, fierce battle. It's going to be a fierce battle in this primary, but in the general election too, if Paxton is the nominee. I think either way, it's going to be a hard race to fight, but I think Democrats are going to be willing to expend a little more political capital in the state, even actual capital. The resources that they have, they're going to be willing to spend more money if Paxton is at the top of that ticket. That could be bad. That could be good. It could be good for the Republicans because it's going to take money away from other states. that maybe are a little more competitive. Places like Georgia, places like Michigan, like Minnesota. Not as much New Hampshire anymore because Chris Sununu is not running, but you are or even North Carolina or Maine, you are taking money away from those states, putting them into a state where Republicans should win this election. But it could be bad where if it really is that close of an election, if there was a lot of political baggage that comes with Paxton that could be uncovered in a general election, that, you could see a tighter election than Republicans want, because then you could see it vice versa, where Republicans then are going to be required to put more political capital into the state in order to just maintain the majority that they have. To win the seat, to maintain the seat that they have, they're going to have to spend more money than they are initially expecting to. But like I said, I expect this race to be closer if Paxton is leading the GOP, if he is the nominee. But ultimately, I believe the GOP is going to win this race either way, even if it's by just a couple points. Like I said, Paxton's on top of the ticket. We're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6 points. But either way, the GOP is winning this race because Texas relies less on independents and Democrats for the GOP to win. They don't have to have that appeal. It's nice to have that appeal, but ultimately, at what sacrifice? You have that appeal broadly. What are you sacrificing? Cornyn, it was Ukraine. It was certain gun safety bills, which were a violation of the Second Amendment. When it comes to Ukraine, like we talked about earlier, it's just ridiculous. They just wanted to throw money at the issue and be done with it. You know why? Well, because some of them are warmongers, because they want to feed the military-industrial complex. We know that ammunition is a huge part of our exports, especially when it comes to Europe, Ukraine, Saudi Arabia. We send them a lot of crap. We send them a lot of ammunition. We send them a lot of military equipment. And, and you hate to say it, but some of these Republicans are bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex. They would rather go to war than try and negotiate something out. And it's just as simple as that, where Republicans, they need to break free from that. They really, really do. But we're going to see what happens. That is going to wrap things up for today. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Who are you voting for? You voting for Paxton or you voting for John Cornyn? Let me know down in the comments. We will catch you next time, folks.